Welcome to AI for Good, the leading, action-oriented, global and inclusive United Nations platform on AI. Organized by the International Telecommunication Union, the United Nations Agency for Digital Technologies, in partnership with 50+ UN sister organizations and co-convened with Switzerland. The goal of AI for Good is to unlock AI's potential to serve humanity. In today's AI for Good event, we are counting on you to use the live video wall feature to ask questions and post comments to help create an engaging discussion. We encourage you to stay until the end to chat, connect, ask questions, and network with our distinguished facilitators and world-class AI experts in the neural network. It is now time to kick off the session and welcome our first speaker. The floor is yours.
Hello everyone. Welcome to another episode of our AI for Good series, which is a thematic series on AI and labor that we moderate here at the ILO and we co-host jointly with International Telecommunication Union. It's a series that is dedicated to discussing topics related to AI and work. And we invite interesting guests who do sort of cutting-edge research, the latest knowledge on this topic, and we discuss. And my name is Paweł Gmyryk. I'm a senior researcher here at the ILO's research department, and I myself work on questions of AI and labor. And today I have the pleasure of moderating a discussion on a topic that is really close to our work here at the ILO, which has to do with why AI exposure of occupations differs across countries in different income brackets. And for that discussion, I am joined today by two excellent speakers. So Dr. Piotr Lewandowski is a labor economist, and he has a PhD in economics. He is the CEO of the board at the Institute for Structural Research, the IBS in Warsaw. And he's also a research fellow at the Institute of Labor Economics in Bonn and at the Leibniz Institute in Essen. His work is focused on technological change, structural and occupational shifts, and climate and energy policies, and how these affect labor market outcomes. And Piotr's work puts a lot of emphasis on the topic that we will be discussing today, which is job quality and evolution of work in both advanced and developing economies. And the second speaker we're discussing today is Dr. Veronica Escudero, who is my colleague here at the research department. She's a labor economist with a lot of experience in evaluating labor market and social policies. She actually leads the ILO's Skills and Active Labor Market Policies and Policy Evaluation Unit at the ILO's research department. And her work focuses on identifying effective policy designs that improve job quality. She also works on skills development, work-to-work transitions, and also puts a lot of emphasis on emerging and developing countries. Veronica has a PhD in economics, and she leads ILO's work on the forthcoming flagship report, which is on lifelong learning and the skills of the future, which will be launched in May 2026. So before I hand over to Piotr, a little bit of logistics for this session. Piotr will present for 25 minutes. After that, Veronica will give some comments, and then we will kick off a discussion that I will moderate, in which I will ask some questions, but I will also take the questions from our audience. And there are two ways to ask questions to us today. One is, the principal way is on the neural network of ITU, where you can ask questions in the chat. But I also know that many colleagues at the ILO watch us on ILO Live channel. And if you are my colleague at the ILO, you can send questions through the Teams chat to me, and I also try to pick them up. Now, keep in mind that I'm here alone, so if you send an essay, it's going to be very difficult for me to summarize it, but if you send short, sharp questions, then I will try to ask them to our speakers. With that, let me kick off and hand over to Piotr. Piotr, go ahead with your presentation.
Thanks so much, Paweł. Thanks so much for the invitation and the kind introduction. So let me share my slides and let's start with research. All right, so I hope you can see the presentation full screen. So in the talk today, I will speak about our effort, an ongoing project with Karol Madden, who's my colleague at IBS here, a research institute that I run here in Warsaw, as well as Albert Park, who's the chief economist of the Asian Development Bank. And in this project, we strive to create worker exposure, measures of workers' exposure to AI that will reflect the differences in the nature of work across countries in different development spectrum. So in the field of labor economics and more broadly, there has been a lot of attention paid over the last few years to AI, but more generally over the last 20 to 30 years to how digital technologies and automation technologies interact with labor and how they affect workers, jobs, and working conditions, both across different types of occupations and in different contexts. So occupations have been at the focal point of that analysis, and very often this research has been facilitated by the wonderful effort of the Department of Labor in the US, who has created two important data sets. First, of the current version of this data set, it's called ONET, and it quantifies the occupational demands, occupational abilities, and occupational tasks in a very rich way. And people have been using that to study labor markets around the world because it's just very handy to use. But I mean, if you have ever worked at in some kind of a low and middle income country context, or I guess for many people at ILO, it will be quite intuitive that not all jobs are the same around the world. So on the left panel here on the slide, I'll show you a job of the car mechanic in the US or Canada, but it's definitely North America. But on the right panel, just to compare, is a job of a car mechanic in a middle income country, which is Thailand here specifically. So the assumption that these occupational tasks are identical in all countries, regardless of their development level, it's quite heroic. But because here, just with this simple illustration, you can see that the job on the left, in terms of the way it's organized, probably the technology that it's available, and then specifically in the way that people work and what kind of task they perform, it's very different than the job on the right. The middle income country mechanic is essentially spending all day cleaning car parts, while the mechanic on the left will be spending more time on the actual work on the engine, but probably will spend also more time on planning the work of other mechanics, maybe when dealing with clients and so on. So these occupational tasks differ, and then the interplay with technologies of these two workers will be also very different, reflecting what they do at work. So since the data on the actual use of AI technologies is very scarce, because we only have a few surveys that are not really uniform in terms of how they measure AI, how they define these technologies. We also have papers that use patent data, but it's definitely not a complete picture, and we don't really have thorough understanding of what's the actual use in the workplace. Because of that, so far, most of the research has focused on exposures. So kind of like connecting the functions of AI or the pace of progress in AI technologies, mapping these technologies and their abilities, mapping these abilities onto occupations. So trying to understand how different occupations and how different occupational tasks can be exposed to AI. And some of these measures are based on tasks, and Paweł has put a lot of effort in the last few years to create these kind of measures. Some of them use, what the work that Paweł and his colleagues did were focused on analyzing, on like mapping the descriptions of occupational tasks with AI functions. Some of the other studies use the ONET data set that I mentioned before, which describes occupations in the US in a quantitative way. But then applying these measures to other countries in the world basically assumes that these occupational tasks are different, which we think is a heroic assumption. So I've been working on that for almost 10 years already, and I have another paper which is out in the World Bank Economic Review in 2022, and there has also been other paper by Caunero and others in World Bank Economic Review in 2023, which uses survey data from around the world to show that actually these task contents are different. These previous papers were not focused on AI; they were more focused on routine, non-routine work, so more generally on complementarities and substitutability with ICT. But we found strong evidence that task content of specific occupations differs across development levels, and that depends on the technology supply in a country, on the skill supply, but also on the position that specific countries and sectors have in global value chains. So then we kind of expect that worker exposures to AI are probably quite different across development too. Here, we're gonna, in this paper, our starting point is a widely used study of Felten and others, who created one of the first measures of AI exposures of occupations using the American data. So they used ONET, and the way they worked in nutshell is as follows. They identified 10 dimensions of AI functionalities, of AI abilities. I just give you, for the sake of brevity, I just give you an example of 3, which are like language modeling, image recognition, speech recognition. Then they calculated a mapping how these particular AI dimensions are related to various occupational abilities. And in ONET, there are 52 this kind of abilities. So you can think about it as weights that map, that connect these particular AI dimensions into various occupational abilities. And then using ONET, that again quantifies the importance, the relevance of the specific abilities in various occupations, basically we're able to calculate the extent to which specific occupations are exposed to these AI technologies. Please note that we talk about exposures because we don't really distinguish here. We don't really judge whether these exposures mean substituting workers at work or whether they mean complementing what people do and improving productivity, let's say the speed or the precision with which people can complete their task. We're talking about exposures. We can talk about it later in the discussion. I think it's still a little bit too early to decide in which particular contexts, occupations, sectors, there will be more substitution and more complementarity. So we're talking about exposures. Our own methodology proceeds as follows. First, we want to start with replicating Felten for the US, but instead of using ONET, which is again a data set available only for the US and describes occupations, we're gonna use survey data for the US, specifically the OECD PX survey, which is a data set, which is a survey that measures adult cognitive skills, but also includes a battery of questions on skill use at work and the frequency of performing particular tasks. So we're going to use this data set to replicate Felten using their assessments of importance of AI for various abilities. But then we're going to replace these abilities with these PIAC questions. Having done that, we will then utilize the PIAC, the STEP, which is Skills Towards Employment program, the data set collected a bunch of years ago by the World Bank, as well as we're going to use 2 ways of China Urban Labor Survey, which is a survey conducted by the Chinese Academy of Social Science, where we have included exactly the same battery of questions of job tasks that are used in PIAC and STEP. So these are free surveys, but they're all comparable. And then, having created this methodology for the US, we're going to take advantage of the fact that the same data has been collected for more than 50 countries around the world. So we are able to create measures of exposures that are at the worker level. That's one nice thing about it. But then the most important thing is that because it's survey-based and the survey are collected in different countries, then the cross-country differences, which we will find here in this paper, will reflect the differences in the frequencies of performing various tasks, rather than some kind of a stylized way of creating cross-country differences, let's say conditioning all endowments. We're going to use countries' endowments to predict these occupational AI tasks. for additional 55 countries that don't have this survey data yet. The PIAC step and COLS surveys cover a lot of countries, but they still don't cover many large emerging economies such as India, Brazil, South Africa. So we're gonna then estimate a bunch of models, knowing what's the relationship between these exposures and various endowments in the current countries where we have survey data. We're gonna estimate the models to make out of sample predictions. So at the end, we're gonna estimate, we're gonna end up with a data set that covers more than 100 countries, and we jointly represent 90% of world's employment. Okay, so just very briefly here. Here, using a, let's say, example of what are these abilities in ONET. So there are two examples here. For instance, perceptual speed or mathematical reasoning. And then there are examples of PIAC questions that we can use as proxies. So for instance, for perceptual speed, we can use questions like how often you are confronted with more complex problems that require at least half an hour to find a good solution. How often do you calculate prices, costs? How often do you read articles? How often do you process information, and so on? But we don't really we want really to be sort of like data driven. So our method to find these connections between PIAC questions and these ONET abilities is based on econometrics. So for each ONET ability, we're going to estimate a model defined across the where the outcome is the relevance of that ability in specific occupations in the US. And we're going to estimate these models against the survey-driven answers to particular tasks, essentially searching for the set of questions in the survey that provide the best proxy. And then instead of using these abilities in the method to calculate exposures, as I mentioned, we're going to use these estimated bundles of questions and the weights and the survey weights, the coefficient. So overall, this is a set of 18 survey questions on occupational tasks that we end up using. It's impossible to read all of them, but so just let me briefly to explain that some of them, the one that you see on the top, relate to more like interpersonal task managing. There is a bench, and then there is a bunch of tasks that also pertain to interactions and managing, organizing time. Then we have a battery of questions which are about processing information. So it's reading stuff in various sources. It's also like writing stuff, calculating, filling in forms. And then we have some questions that are on mathematics, but also on using computers. Unfortunately, the questions that we have in PIAC are about the more rudimentary ways of using computers, like emails, spreadsheets, coding, writing programming code, and stuff like that. So when it comes to our first step, which is replicating the exposures for the US, we do a pretty good job here. So the correlation between the original Felton calculated with ONET, and which is the x-axis here, and our version, which is calculated using the survey questions for the US, is 91%. So we are able to replicate this distribution for the US pretty well. Having done that, we can then apply that same methodology to more than 50 countries around the world. And to describe our results and understand what are the stylized facts on these cross-country differences in exposures, we estimate the following progressions. We're going to relate this worker level exposure to AI to 4 fundamental factors. The ICT use, the ICT intensity, which is the likelihood, the probability that the worker in a given country and sector uses computer at work. Please note that this technology-related variable is calculated at the sector level. So we're not really using information who's using computer at work, because that would be clearly endogenous also to the allocation of tasks. But we're using this information on what are the differences between sectors in countries in the intensity of using computers at work. Then we have worker level human capital. This is important. The surveys that we use allow us to go beyond just capturing education level. There are measures of cognitive skills in these surveys. So we can capture the heterogeneity of human capital within specific countries and occupations, but also the fact that there are these cognitive skill tests allow us to capture differences in schooling quality between different countries. And then we have a bunch of occupation fixed effects at a two-digit ISCO level, firm characteristics that capture both the position in global value chains as well as the use of novel technologies and ICT technologies in countries by firms in different countries. This is taken from the World Bank Enterprise Survey. And then we have development indicators just to control for all the omitted variable bias. The measurements, yeah, I just go very briefly here. Basically, I mentioned that, so I'll move on. And then the final methodological slide is that then we will use the same 4 fundamental factors conceptually, but just to make the out of sample predictions, we're going to estimate the model at the country occupation level, relating our exposures to these 4 fundamental factors. But we're going to use data on technology, human capital that are widely available and measured at the country level. Some of them are actually taken from ITU, I think, as the digital readiness index. But we also have the use of internet. We have schooling quality. So these measures at a country level allow us to make this out of sample prediction. Let me move to results. So the first stylized fact is that according to the survey data that we use, and then these out of sample predictions, this distribution, the variance of these exposures to AI of work across the development spectrum is substantial. On the left panel on that figure, you can see the exposures for managers in various countries, in these 50 countries with survey data, that is calculated by essentially merging the Felten exposures calculated originally for the US. So it's basically merging the American exposures to countries at various development level. And you can see that this line on the left panel is essentially flat. It's some variance. Why? Because there are differences in occupational compositions at a more granular level, because we merged that not at 1-digit occupations, but at a more disaggregated level. So there are these tiny differences, but it's essentially flat. Then if we, on the right panel, when we look at the exposures that reflect the cross-country differences in performing various tasks, then we find that there is a strong development gradient. Poorer countries have a much lower exposure to AI in the specific occupation than more developed countries. Oh, by the way, I forgot to mention that just for the sake of, just to have the common reference point, 0 throughout this presentation, 0 always means the exposure of average American worker. The average American worker in the total economy. So of course here, these red squares show you the US. The managers in the US have a higher exposure than average American worker, which is intuitive. But then the managers, let's say in China, which is here, or in the bottom, or in Philippines, or in Kenya, the managers in these countries have a lower exposure to AI, even lower than the average American worker. The second stylized fact is that these gradients are strong. These gradients are strong for various types of high-skilled occupations. So it's for professionals, the same for technicians, which I don't show here for clarity, for the sake of time. But then once we move to like more middle-skilled occupations like clerical workers or sales and services, which I also don't show here, it becomes flatter. So these differences between more and less developed countries become less acute. And then when we move to like more, let's say, lower skilled or more manual intensive occupations like plant and machine operators, there is some variance, but it's basically not driven by differences in GDP per capita, which makes sense because the differences there are not necessarily that large as for managers, which are much more, let's say, cognitive intensive, and then, or professionals. And AI is much more about cognitive tasks than manual tasks, which are much more affected by industrial automations. The second stylized fact is that when we estimate these models, that at the worker level, and then we perform variance decomposition, we want to combine the differences in these various factors with the coefficients. And then we want to decompose the cross-country differences in these AI exposures into the contribution of various factors, in these 4 fundamental factors that I mentioned, plus the occupational structure. And then we find that we can attribute the most of the cross-country differences to ICT intensity use, to the intensity of ICT use. So to cross-country differences in how likely it is in specific sectors that workers use computers at work. That contributes about 40% of the cross-country variance in this workers' AI exposure, which is more than the actual occupational structure. That also suggests that a large part of this cross-country in the overall distribution, overall variance in AI exposure across countries is driven by the within occupational differences rather than by differences in occupational structures per se. Occupational structures contribute a lot, but so the fact that in less developed countries there are the employment shares of the highly skilled occupations are lower, and the higher shares of employment are in manual occupations, so that contributes, but less than the differences in ICT use intensity. Human capital is also important. It contributes slightly less than the occupational structure. Please bear in mind that if we estimate, we do it in the paper, when we re-estimate the model without these occupational controls, then the role of human capital is larger. Why? Because in countries, you can also think that human capital partly affects these occupational structures. Countries with higher human capital will have more workers in these highly skilled occupations. Here, where we capture human capital, once we control for occupational structure, that means that we capture the role of human capital conditional or occupational structure. So within the differences in human capital between managers in different countries, the differences in human capital between clerical workers in different countries. But of course, the fact that there are more professionals in high-income countries than in low-income countries, that also reflects human capital as well. Then firm and sector characteristics, we don't really attribute that much to that. So that differs with the purely like routine, non-routine task, where we found that global value chains play a slightly larger role. For AI, for purely AI exposure, it doesn't seem to be that relevant. It's mostly about ICT, human capital, and then the occupational structures, or yes. And there is also time trend. Time trend is something that we estimate for just a bunch of countries. For 14 PIAC countries, we have 2 measurements over time. So we can then also study how these AI exposures have evolved in these countries between early 2010s and the period of 2022-2023, because that's the second cycle of PIAC. Unfortunately, that's a subsample of high-income countries only, and the availability and the granularity of the more recent PIAC data is not that rich as it was in the first cycle. So we only have 14 countries where we have 2 data sets of PIAC with very detailed information on occupations and education, and also the skill measurements. But when we do that, we see that for the vast majority of countries, the AI exposure have increased over time. That's the black diamond here. We attribute most of that growth to ICT intensity, which is ICT intensity. So it's the increasing use of computers across the economy that also translates into this rising AI exposure. But interestingly, you can see that in these countries, high income, human capital, which is this pinkish thing here, barely contributes. But importantly, that striped bar here, which is the time trade. So we put a fixed effect into the second wave of the surveys here. So that's an increase, let's say, the growth in AI exposure, which is across the economy, across all kinds of jobs, and cannot be really attributed to what happens with ICT and with human capital and any other observables that we have. And that pushes the exposure up, so that you can think about it, that there is some shift in the task compositions over time towards more AI exposed tasks that you can't really explain with just changes in computer use or human capitals per se. So for me, that's maybe a soft signal that it's slightly about complementarity, and that that in these more recent surveys where AI was already available, people generally tend to perform more tasks where this AI, the AI exposed. So that, to me, may suggest that there might be some complementarity going on. All right, the final slides with the results. Having estimated these AI exposures for more than 100 countries, and combining that with the ILOstat data on occupational composition structures in various countries, we can then rank all the countries in the world, all country occupations in the world by their AI exposures, and we can define the most exposed jobs as the top 25% of that weighted ranking, weighted by population employment size in specific countries and occupations, and we can define the least exposed jobs as the bottom 25% of that global ranking. And here we find a strong polarization of these AI exposures around the world. So the workers who are most exposed globally, about almost 60% of them are in high-income countries, which we split here into this lower tier, upper tier. But most importantly, the most exposed workers are about 60% of them are in high-income countries, while these high-income countries represent about 25% of global employment. And then the least exposed workers, about 60% of them are in lower or lower middle income countries, while only 17% of most exposed workers are in these countries, and these countries contribute 40% of global employment. So these AI exposures are strongly polarized across the development spectrum. All right, so let me wrap up because I'm running out of time. So I do believe that accounting for, and I hope I've convinced you that accounting for worker tasks is crucial in assessing these individual and country-specific exposures. We find that there is a substantial heterogeneity between countries, especially in high-skilled occupations such as professionals, managers, technicians. We attribute most of these differences into cross-country differences in ICT use intensity, followed by occupational structures and human capital. And then using these AI exposures, we find that that highly exposed workers cluster in high-income countries, while low-exposed workers are clustered in low and lower middle-income countries. So then, depending on your prior belief, let's say, on whether AI will substitute or complement workers, if it's going to be about substitution, then AI will probably compress the global distribution of income because it's going to hurt workers in high-income countries more. But if you believe that it's more complementarity and rising productivity and earnings, then AI will probably widen the global income distribution because it's the workers in high-income countries that will benefit the most first. All right, thanks so much for the invitation again and for listening. I will now stop sharing.
Great. Thank you very much, Piotr. It's such an excellent presentation, but above all, excellent underlying work. Really impressive data work and impressive coverage of your data as well. And a really clear breakdown that you gave us in terms of how you come to these conclusions and the methods you use. And I want to now pass over to Veronica for some comments on this work, but also broader comments, and that comes also with some questions from me, which is around this flagship report that I mentioned in the introduction, Veronica, that you're working on, or that's basically, I think, finalized by now. But I know that as part of that work, you're looking essentially at jobs announcements, and you scan how skills demand evolves over time, but also how it differs across countries. And I wonder whether you see similar patterns that reflect also this difference between high-income and low-income economies that Piotr has been telling us about based on his decomposition of tasks of occupations in different economic contexts. So over to you, Veronica. Thank you.
Thank you, Pavel, very much for the invitation to be here. I'm very happy to be here. And thank you, Piotr, also from my side for this very interesting presentation. I not only enjoyed your presentation, but I also enjoyed very much reading your paper. And I believe that it makes a highly valuable contribution to a question that is very central for us all, which is how artificial intelligence interacts with labor markets at different stages of development. So let me try to situate your findings, Piotr, in light of our own ongoing work for the ILO flagship report on lifelong learning and skills for the future, as requested by Pavel. And in particular, in terms of chapter 4, and his underlying academic paper, where we look at the role of skills in shaping the labor market impacts of emerging digital technologies. So we don't focus specifically on AI, but broader sense of digital technologies, including AI. And I would like to focus on 4 main points that stand out when I look at your work, Piotr, alongside the work that we are doing in my team, but also the existing literature. First, let me tell you a little bit of how I see what your paper shows and why I think that it matters so much. One of the most important insights in my view of your paper is that AI exposure is not uniform across the globe. And I think that this is very novel. And workers in low-income countries are on average almost a full standard deviation less exposed to AI, if I remember correctly, than workers in high-income countries. But critically, and more importantly, it is not because people in poorer countries work in different occupations, which is what we always think, but it is because the actual tasks that are performed within occupations differ so much. And the picture in your first or second slide was very telling. And this is a very important message in my view. It shows that AI is entering work through tasks. And this is also work that has been done by Pavel, by the way, and not only through occupations. It also means that 2 people with exactly the same job title, and this I'm bringing of the work that I do, may be performing completely different tasks and therefore have completely different levels of exposure, only depending on the country where they work or they live. Another thing that I find very compelling in your paper is the decomposition. When you adjust for within occupation task differences, the cross-country gaps become even larger than before, especially among high-skill occupations such as managers, professionals, and technicians. And why I think that this is important is that this finding reverses the common assumption that developing countries might be more exposed because of task routinization. And this is also something that I believe Pavel and your co-authors from the World Bank are showing in your recent paper. Instead, your paper, Piotr, shows that many workers in low and middle income countries simply don't use the types of tasks that AI is currently complemented. So exposure is structurally lower. The final point that I want to bring from your paper is that the excellent job that you are doing in identifying what drives these differences. And you find that ICT intensity is clearly the strongest factor, followed by education and literacy, or human capital, as you call it. And very interestingly, at least for me, integration in global value chains appears to be associated with lower exposure for many low and middle income economies, which was a new finding for me. And I guess that this is mainly due to the concentration in upstream or routine intensive activities. To answer to Pavel's point, these results resonate strongly with the work that we are currently finalizing for the flagship report, which focus, as I said before, more broadly on emerging digital technologies beyond AI. And this brings me to the second point that I want to bring today. I mentioned 4 points. We use a different measure of exposure. We use a tech exposure measure using patents to emerging digital technologies. And we also observe a very clear digital exposure gradient across development levels. Highly exposed regions cluster mainly in high-income countries, and a very few higher middle-income countries. In contrast, large parts of Sub-Saharan Africa, South and Southeast Asia, and Central America, for example, show very consistently low exposure. And in that sense, your findings, Piotr, regarding AI are highly consistent with what we see more broadly in the realm of digital technology. So in a way, we can see that there's a layering of a new AI divide on top of the existing digital divide, which is a very interesting complementary findings. Now, the logical next question is what happens when workers are exposed to these technologies, which is the third point that I want to bring to the discussion. And what we find in the flagship report and the academic paper underlying that report's findings is that exposure can be indeed employment enhancing. Even if exposure is much lower in low-income countries, which we also find, it can still be employment enhancing as digitalization often enters through complementary job creating channels, not direct job creating channels such as mobile technologies, online commerce, digital payments, or even logistics. Now, in light of your findings, Piotr, on the differences in task content within occupations, which also speaks to the paper of Pavel and co-authors from the World Bank, it's clear that some of these effects may actually be overstated and that we should be taking into account this task composition. Because if workers perform very different tasks within the same occupation, then the expected impacts of AI in those settings may also be overstated. And this is, of course, a question mark that we have when we look at it beyond AI and on digital technologies. What we find in high-income countries is pretty much in line with the literature, and is that the effects on employment are also positive with signs of polarization. So this means that both high-skilled and low-skilled workers benefit the most, which, as I said, is in line with the literature. So to answer to Pavel's question, I believe that the two pieces of work speak very neatly to each other. Your paper, Pavel, explains who is exposed in a very accurate way, and taking into account the task composition of occupations, our research tried to shed light of what happens when exposure actually takes place. And the fourth point and last point, which is in my view the most important for policy, concerns the skill. And when I read your paper in light of the existing literature and my own work, Piotr, I see that the role of skills stand out in two distinct but connected ways, which I also would like to hear your views. First, skills determine who is exposed. Your paper shows that higher education and a strong literacy proficiency, but above all, greater ICT intensity push workers into tasks that are more exposed to the AI. So skills and digital readiness shape the potential in a way for AI to affect workers. And the second point is that skills determine whether exposure becomes opportunity or exclusion. And this is our complement to your work, where we show that regions with a stronger presence of jobs requiring cognitive skills, because as Pavel mentioned before, our work is focused on vacancies and therefore on the demand side. And so we find that jobs that require, that demand cognitive skills, which can be core and sophisticated cognitive skills, communication management, and basic digital abilities, are precisely those that turn exposure to new technologies into positive employment effects. And to nuance this and make the findings a bit more complex, we find that advanced digital skills are not always protective, actually, and that in high-income countries, for example, they tend to benefit middle and high educated workers. But in lower income countries, they can be associated with displacement of both low and high educated workers. So there's a wide range of possible outcomes. And I believe that the skills composition is a key mediating factor, which in my view is a critical point when thinking about policy. So let me finish with a couple of reflections on policy and the challenges ahead, and a question for you, Piotr. On the question of exposure, I think your paper provides an essential piece of the story of AI and labor markets, as I mentioned before. It tells us where exposure is concentrated, who is affected, and why these patterns differ so sharply across countries. Now, in our work, we look at what happens once that exposure takes place and how different skills structures shape whether new technologies translate into more or fewer jobs. From this perspective, so from the perspective of what happens once that exposure takes place, from my reading is that if countries invest in the right kind of skills and in the digital ecosystems that enable those skills to translate into productive tasks, if we can put it that way, AI can support more inclusive labor market outcomes. But if we disregard these skills, the difference in AI exposure we see today risks turning into a much deeper inequality in opportunities tomorrow. But of course, and this brings me to the question, reaching this stage requires something prior, which is reducing the initial gap in AI exposure across countries. And I want to hear from you, Piotr, if exposure depends so strongly on underlying task structures, but also on ICT intensity, what do you see as the most realistic levers for countries with low exposure to create the conditions for AI to enter productively in the first place? It is mainly about digital infrastructure or firm capabilities, sectoral upgrading, or something else altogether. Thank you.
Thanks so much. So thank you, Veronica. So I truly appreciate your comments, all the kind words and all the suggestions. It's great to hear that that this work can be useful for the work research that you do at the ILO. The last question. So there's one caveat, and then maybe I'll try to answer. It is of course possible to some extent that when we talk about the potential role of skills in shaping whether the AI will be complementary or whether it will substitute jobs, it is possible that the skills that we measure in the surveys, which are more general cognitive skills, like literacy, numeracy, it is possible that these general measures of cognitive skills are not specific enough to actually understand very well how this complementarity versus substitutability plays out, because it's possible that it might be about some more narrowly defined skills that drive that rather than the overall literacy or numeracy. But in the sort of cross-country context, still getting these cognitive skills, even at the more basic definitions, it's still such an effort that it's great that we have that. I do believe that it's that this binding constraint, it's in the let's say ICT, it's in the digital infrastructure and the penetration of various firms with ICT technology, access to computers, access to cloud, and so on. I think that often the spread of digital technologies quite recently has been about more like private type of leisure use very often rather than productive use in the workplace and solving problems. For instance, even using the example of Poland, which in the global distribution is already advanced country, it's a high income country, but we still have this debate on relatively low investment rate and the low penetration of ICT technology. And there has been a very interesting report and a survey of firms by the World Bank a couple of years ago that studied the adoption of ICT technologies as a firm capital. So an investment in ICT technologies that are specific, let's say, business technologies, not really general use. And then looking at the software that assists financial planning, software that assists resource management, and so on. And then it turned out that there is a huge gap between like the largest firms that all have these tools and then the smaller gaps and the smaller firms. So then asking, why are not the smaller firms, let's say firms with up to 100 workers, why they don't invest in this technology that can improve productivity, how you run company, and have this productivity gains essentially driven by organization of work? Is it skills? Is it lack of finance to invest? And then it turned out that the most common reason provided for not investing was essentially, we don't believe we will benefit, we don't know how to use it. So is it more like awareness? Is it more like a lack of skills to understand how these technologies can be useful, that it's not necessarily for scrolling only, but it can maybe solve much more practical problems that you have in the workplace? I think there will be, let's say, some large multinationals right now that are maybe even overly optimistic about how AI can change the way they work. But then the other end of the spectrum, we have millions of smaller firms that probably don't really think about it as a tool that can essentially democratize access to some kind of organizational or managerial knowledge of skills. So in that sense, if this are these guys running this car workshop that I showed initially, are they aware that maybe there are skills in planning, um, managing, their warehouse or organizing work, what to do one after another, how to sequence tasks. Their skills might not be that great. Are they aware that if they use the available tools, the AI tools that are currently available, they essentially have the MBA knowledge and weaved inside them. So maybe the smaller firms can actually access that and okay, can you plan how we can sequence the task in our company? It will do it. Will it be perfect? Maybe not, but it still can be an improvement. But then, so I do believe that it's the ICT infrastructure, the penetration. To some extent, it's also cost of this ICT technology, but I do think that it's a binding obstacle. I think it's bigger than the overall skills. Why? Because similarly, like in a development accounting, let's say, I'm more in the Scatelli Coleman type of school of thinking, who showed that the global income differences are more driven by differences in technology rather than skills. That's why people with a certain level of skills who move from the low technology setting, let's say India, to a high technology setting, let's say US, their earnings immediately increase a lot. So it's probably that there are skills underutilized in the low technology setting rather than they don't really lack skills to use technology in the low technology setting. So I think there's a lot of work to be done but also maybe in how availability of knowledge and maybe training, how we can use this productively, right? Not to just, as a playtime activity and generating stupid pictures with AI because it's for free, so we can have fun, but also how firms at different type of advancement level and development spectrum can utilize these tools to improve the way they work.
Great. Thank you very much for this really rich discussion. Actually, there have been a lot of questions. I had a lot of questions myself, but I have a feeling that you actually addressed most of them in the discussion, and we don't have that much time left. So let me first of all pick up here a clarifying question, one or two for Piotr's methods. There is someone asking us about the main difference in your approach and the one done by the IMF, for example, in the 2024 paper. I think that's Carl Lucas and others who also look at 6 different countries from ONET. I know the answer to this, but I think you also know it, and that it had. So I let you answer this. We also have a colleague at the ALO asking. Again, I think it's a methodological question. You're explaining this AI exposure in different countries, which is measured at occupational level. But then one of the explanatory factors is occupational composition. So sort of how these two play together. But as I understand you explaining the average or overall exposure at the country level, depending on the occupational structures. And then maybe just since we have very little time, and it would be really nice to hear from the two of you, let me pick up another question that I think translates, that's something that we are often asked in these discussions. Beyond the big policies, you mentioned that you can have high digital skills you have high IT skills, and in a low-income setting, you can end up working on a digital platform, cleaning data for training of AI models. That's what our colleagues working here at the ILO on the working digital platforms have shown. And that can be a big limit. So sort of the environment around you can be this limitation that you mentioned, Piotr. But if you're an individual watching us today, somewhere in a lower income country, someone who is interested in AI, who wants to develop their skills and wants to find opportunities in this, what kind of skills do you invest in? Not looking at the big policies, but you as an individual, how do you focus? How do you create opportunities for yourself to be able to access high income jobs and more interesting jobs higher in the value chain, for example, of AI, or more in the AI integration into, for example, business context? So maybe let's start with you, Piotr, and then Veronica, and then we will have to close.
All right, thanks so much. The first two are very quick. So the IMF paper uses ONET only. So they take Felton, then they add something else, which we will call complementarity versus substitution, which is again only measured with ONET, with the American data. And then they merge the indicators created for the US with American data to 6 countries in the world. And then all the country differences between these 6 countries, I think was like South Africa was one of them, I don't remember the others. All the differences that they show reflect differences between these countries in their occupational structure under the heroic assumption that a manager in South Africa and an accountant in South Africa have exactly the same exposure to AI as a manager and an accountant respectively in the US. So you may like it or not, I'm not a fan of this approach because I just think it's too heroic to go with the American data outside of the OECD, but that's the main difference. What we do is we use this survey data collected across the development spectrum, and then we calculate the measures that reflect the differences in frequencies in performing of different tasks. So our is country-specific measurement, not country-specific only occupational structure. Second, the second question, well, yes. So first we estimate this model at the worker level, and we try to understand the differences in these exposures at the average country level. So try to decompose the average difference between Poland and the US into the contribution of differences in occupational structures and the contributions of various factors, which may explain why within occupations we find differences exposures. So I hope that clarifies. The third one, yeah, of course it's tough. So there will be a lot of people who do sort of like jobs which they might be overskilled for. They based in low and middle income countries just because these routine, simple jobs available online essentially pay better than probably performing nominally more skilled jobs locally. I do think that countries at different development levels should invest in expanding their own capabilities in AI, and it's going to be very hard to compete with building state-of-the-art models and out-competing, let's say, the US models or European or Chinese. But I do believe there is a great potential in building your own capacity within countries in trying to support the local development of implementation. So have local developers work on how you can use the AI to improve how your administration work, how access to health can be improved, how you can manage firms, what you can offer, let's say, firms in informal sector, even in terms of speeding things up. So I think there's a lot of potential in investing in applications of AI and state-of-the-art technologies in solving local problems at the different development level. And I think there is a big opportunity and government should expand that, and that will also create job opportunities for people locally.
Fantastic. So now in 2 minutes, Veronica, if I am an individual who is young, very keen on this technology and wants to learn, what do I invest in if I live not in a very high income country, but in a lower income country? How do I go about it if my solution is not to change countries, but to develop myself and create opportunities in that setting?
A very important question, Pavel. And I think that coming to the work that we do, one aspect of this work that can enlighten this question is that what we observe is that in analyzing the demand for these types of skills, so jobs that demand AI and machine learning skills, AI-related skills never appear alone. They always appear in combination with other types of skills, which combine technical abilities with a rich set of transferable and socio-emotional skills, actually. So worker needs to communicate, collaborate, solve problems, manage projects, understand context, adapt quickly in order to even get to these positions. And why I think that this is important from the perspective of a person that wants to work in these jobs is that we also find that jobs that require this comprehensive set of skills are also jobs that are better paid and have higher quality. So what I would suggest people is to prepare themselves not only on the very narrow technical skills that they will, of course, require to access these jobs, but also to invest in this broader set of skills that will allow them to not only get to those jobs in the first place, but also progress within those jobs in jobs of higher quality, including better paid.
Thank you, Veronica. So it seems like in the times of AI, it can be very tempting to spend most of your time with a computer. And it's fascinating to do that. But it seems that one of the core abilities remains to be able to also spend time with humans and work with them using those different IT skills and abilities. Look, we extended the session because it was such an interesting discussion, but now we will have to wrap it up. And actually, it is the last session for this year. We've completed a full round of discussions that can be found on ILO Live channel. If you just Google AI for Good and ILO Live, you will find a whole series of very interesting discussions we had this year. You can also find them on ITU's neural network. And we will be back next year with a new series of discussions that continue on this topic. Piotr and Veronica, I really want to thank you for today. It was a great discussion. I learned a lot. I had a lot of fun, and I'm sure our audiences have also benefited a lot from this. Everyone can find this video together with other videos in where I mentioned on ILO pages and ITU pages. So if someone missed it today, don't hesitate to recommend it to them to rewatch it. With that, thank you very much and see you next time.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you very much.
And thanks everyone for watching and your questions.
Thank you.
Thank you for participating in today's AI for Good session. We hope you've learnt something new, innovative, and engaging in today's event. We now encourage you to continue the conversation on the live video wall in the neural network. Here you can ask questions, like and comment, share links, complete the poll, connect with interesting profiles, or speak one-on-one using the chat and video function. We invite you to explore the lobby, try the smart matching quiz, visit the virtual exhibits, poster boards, the e-shop, and build your personalized AI for Good program. Let's shape the future of AI for good.